We're going to be talking about the value of having an integrated pest management plan. Hey everyone who's joining here, the advantage of an integrated pest management strategy, and what are some of the benefits of having that plan, what are the costs associated with cultivation that a good integrated pest management strategy can sort of alleviate. And I have a few examples here with my notes. IPM plans that save resources, time, money, and labor. And we're going to talk about some of the other factors as well. So some major cultivation costs, right? The first one is what I'm terming here the most precious resource, which is time. You don't get that back. You can't buy it back. You can't cultivate it back. It's not an input that you can put back into your grow. It's only input that you can use up every second, including watching this live stream. Not to make anyone existential, but that is the case. So one of the best things that you can do is actually take that opportunity to learn something about your cultivation and about techniques that you can utilize and things like that. It's also constantly in effect, right? Time doesn't stop. So it's a resource that's constantly being spent, whether you're using it for some specific goal or you're not. So I'm not saying that people shouldn't relax or have time to themselves or anything like that, but it's an important resource, right? Especially when we're talking about preventing something that occurs at a seasonal sort of interval or happens regularly in some other way. So you only have a certain amount of time in which to prepare. In addition to that, we have inputs, right? Those are costs. Some people are able to sort of neutralize those costs by recycling products that they have, or plant matter, or other sort of resources they have naturally. And that's a really excellent way to make the most efficient use of your inputs, right? But this also includes things like consumables, so like equipment and products, things that you can't necessarily bring to bear personally, that you're going to have to either purchase or somehow acquire elsewise. And also, as an example, things like substrate and of course water and accessible nutrients. So accessible nutrients in particular, so not just you don't just apply fertilizer and have sort of a nutrient flow. You can apply something and the nutrients not be accessible, or you can be growing in a situation where the nutrients aren't as easily accessible as they could be, and there are various products that people might want to apply, or just different cultivation strategies that they have to use in their particular environments that will allow them to make the best use of it. So they might inherit a situation where they don't have full mastery or full control of the situation. And I've definitely encountered that myself, especially if you're in a new grow situation, a new property, or if you're just growing for the first time at your house. You might not have all the things available to you that other people might. And on top of that, we have labor. So this is not just a commercial aspect. Obviously, in a commercial setting, you employ somebody or somebodies, and you are in some way remunerating that relationship. And usually there's a cost associated with that as well. Obviously, there's an operational cost. There's also an occupational cost too. Whether you're paying somebody $10 or $25 or $100 an hour, or whatever their rate is, they also have an occupational cost. So they can't do necessarily two things at once, right? Maybe you hire two people to do something so that the task takes less time, right? And there's various ways that people want to strategize about how they're using their labor. That's on a sort of a commercial level, but even at a home grow level, your own labor is important to yourself, and you want to make sure that you're maximizing the amount of time that you have available, right? Your own labor is important. It's also going to have a major impact on your ability to react to a problem and also to prevent a problem from happening. And the main way is in the way that we talked about in the last session, I would say, which is through crop scouting, through being able to actually look at your plants, have the time, have the domain knowledge that allows you to take a look at your plants and assess and evaluate that damage. What is it? Is it some sort of physical damage that I might have done, while I was looking at my plants last time? Is it a problem that is a pest related problem? Is it an environmental problem? having all that domain knowledge allows you to make an informed decision, and then you're able to create a plan of action and then tackle that action with an objective. Not only just your own time, but also the time of other people is important in that case. And then of course we have money, which is a fungible resource, and you use it to support inputs and labor and a bunch of other stuff too. And that is an important aspect. And even if you're not growing in a commercial way, there's a monetary cost usually for most people that's associated with their growing. For other people, this might not be as important, but it is important to a lot of people, and it's the reason why people are going to make decisions for purchasing product, for where they're going to spend their money to maybe receive more information or education about certain qualities of their grow, maybe to understand better the dynamics in the soil, perhaps to understand better the pests that they're going to be dealing with, perhaps just to understand plant health in general, perhaps to get a higher education in general at college, who knows? So all of these things are sort of a factor. But I have a few examples here for us. For example, one of the most important things that you can do is have, and I'm sure you guys are going to expect this, an IPM plan, a standard operating procedure. Just having that by itself is going to be so important for all kinds of cost saving. You don't have to spend a lot of time frenetically looking on the internet for a solution to your problem, because you already know what the potential solutions are, maybe in aggregate, and then you've also narrowed them down to the ones that are most viable, not only for your particular problem, your particular setup, your particular environment, and also what you are able to be capable of yourself with the resources that you have. This is probably the biggest reason why the answer to so many questions that I get and that other people get is it depends, right? Because it does depend. It depends very much about how you're growing, your goal in your cultivation, your end goal, what you actually want to get out of it. Is it a certain amount of yield? Is it a particular profile, no matter the yield? Is it both? It's usually a confluence of many things that you're trying to sort of approach and kind of weigh, essentially. Which ones are more important? Which ones are less important? Where do I have to make concessions? Where must I make concessions, right? Whether you can or whether you have to is also a big factor as well, right? An SOP increases the efficiency of your time, right? One of the big resources we talked about already, and your inputs, and your labor, and your money through preparation, but also through knowing those best practices, and particularly the ones that are important for your particular setup. You can't just simply generalize. In some cases you can, but in most cases you're still going to have to make some sort of an alteration because the resources that somebody has available to them is going to be different generally. And I'm sure everyone in the comments will have examples where they're going to be different from somebody else. And for those who don't know, we will have a questions and answer section after the main topic, so maybe 30 or 40 minutes in, we're going to talk about mostly questions and answers. So preventive measures, right? They have a cost as well, but the only way that a preventive measure is helpful for anyone is if the cost, whether monetary, temporal, resource-based, and input, whatever, if the cost associated is less than what it would take to just simply react to the problem, then it's beneficial. If it doesn't cost less, if it costs more to be preventative than it does to be reactive, then there's a massive incentive to not have a preventative function in your SOP, right? Because it costs more money to do that. And the only time it would really make sense is if you can just make that resource make sense. I did mention money just now, but also we have to consider your own physical capabilities and how much time you have to do those sorts of things, right? So here's an example, right? If you have, let's say, budworms, let's say you have an outdoor crop. I have some data here from a survey. The title of the survey is called First Known Survey of Cannabis Production Practices in California, and that was published in California Agriculture. And this was published in 2019, but the data is from 2017. tried to find some more information to sort of balance out, but there isn't a whole lot of survey data out there, and if this is the first one published in 2019, then we know there's a big difference that happened between 2019 and now in 2023 freshly. There's a big difference, so some of these numbers might have to be increased or decreased, but I do have some examples here. So 2017, crop damage, there was 20% of the people surveyed that had zero crop damage at all. That's actually pretty significant. I wasn't expecting that number. Important to note that for the context, for those who want to know about the research, you can look it up. I'm also going to try to provide the information in the YouTube edit for this section. So if you come back to my YouTube channel, Zenthanol, you'll have a bunch of the questions that people asked, and also you'll have the information that I'm referring to here. So they mentioned that 20% had zero crop damage. About 37% had between 1 to 5% crop damage. Now they didn't really quantify what crop damage meant, so we don't really know if they're talking about floral tissue, if we're talking about leaf tissue, we're talking about other kinds of tissue damage that indirectly affects the yield rather than directly affecting the yield by killing the bud or destroying the yield, the floral product that you want to have. So we don't really know what that means, unfortunately. But if we assume that it means, at least some kind of damage, that's going to have some sort of effect on your growth, and perhaps some of it was bud related. Certainly some of the pests mentioned were certainly flower related. So 1.5% damage, 37% surveyed said they had at least that much. 16% said they had between 5 or 10% of their total crop damaged by pests. 21% said that 10 to 25% was damaged, and then only about 6% reported that greater than 25% crop damage occurred from pests. So that means that 80% of growers sustained pest damage. So that's a significant majority, even though a good portion of them didn't have any. A lot of people did, right? The most common arthropod pests surveyed were mites, and they don't really say, and they assess this point in the research report, that people said mites, but they weren't always sure whether they meant russet mites or two-spot spider mites. In the report, they also mentioned Tetronychus cinnaberinus, which is the cinnabar mite, which used to be thought of as two different species, but is actually now known to be the same species as the two-spot spider mite. So a little bit disappointing to see that that was promulgated in this research. This has been known for a pretty long time at this point. But yeah, we don't really know what mites were being talked about. I imagine that spider mites were probably very common. Russet mites were also probably very common. Most of the surveyed people came from California, a little bit from Oregon as well. So just to give you an idea about where some of this information is coming from. They had mites at 70% reported, 25% reported thrips, 17% reported aphids, and 15% reported unknown larvae. I don't really know what that means either. I assume that they mean like caterpillars that turn into moths and butterflies. They might have meant like larval fungus gnats. They might have meant something else, but I think they mean canopy feeding larvae in this particular case. And the most common pathogens. Powdery mildew was reported for 43% of cultivators. Budrot was reported for 30% of cultivators, and stem and root, and they also included bud rot as well in this other section. This survey, I don't know how it was constructed really, but I'm very surprised that bud rot appeared twice. They say 12%, so I don't know what fraction of that is or isn't in also the bud rot data. So I'm sorry, I'm going to put the information in the visual in the edit, and you guys can tell me what you think about that. So that means that mites and thrips were the most common. This is also pretty common in agriculture too, especially spider mites. They're exceedingly common, and they feed on so many different kinds of plants. And there are many kinds of thrips. There are over 6,000 species that are documented, but only a fraction of 1% of thrips are actually a major problem for agriculture. There's like 12 to 20 different species that are like the main problems, and the other ones are basically no problem at all. And Western flower thrips is probably one of the most egregious. It's certainly the most researched, and it's certainly something I've seen in cannabis as well. But there's several other thrip species that can affect cannabis, and we probably don't know all of the different ones that may be a potential pest. It's also important to note that thrips, not only can they cause physical damage to their feeding, which will affect yield, but many thrips are also very competent vectors of viruses. So some of those viruses could potentially get into cannabis and then cause a major problem, and then the yield loss is going to be much more significant. This is also true for aphids, for that matter. We are now finding that several species of aphids that do feed on cannabis are known to be able to vector certain viruses. Rice root aphid is one of them. Cannabis aphid, believe it or not, has been in some testing with regards to viral vectoring. And then of course we have the infamous hop latent viroid, and whether or not that can be vectored by insect vectors is not totally known. I've seen some people say that they have tested and have some data that shows support for the possibility that aphids can vector hop latent viroid as well as other viruses, but at the moment that information I want to sort of be a little bit more clear. I'd like to see some more peer review on that, not because I think it's not possible or plausible, but because it happens where sometimes something that seems really likely actually isn't, and that's the whole point of doing this kind of research in the first place. So really be sure if it happens, to what extent it happens, what are the mechanisms and why it happens, and then what we can do then, knowing all of that, to sort of protect ourselves. Okay, so they also mentioned average yield. Now again, this is a survey and people are responding to the survey, so there are all of the caveats that have to do with survey biases are in play here, right? So maybe they didn't always answer totally truthfully. Maybe they didn't recall correctly, or they have recall bias in some way. Maybe there's a little bit of confirmation bias, and maybe there's some other things going on as well. So we have to, consider that. I'm certainly aware of this possibility as I'm giving you these numbers, and I would be very interested to hear what people think of the averages, because this is supposedly from 2017, and I know things have become a skosh more difficult for cultivators of cannabis in particular, but very much for other farmers as well. They say indoor had an average yield of about 72 grams per square foot, or about 0.16 pounds per square foot. 57% reported that they harvest 4 times a year. 29% reported that they harvested 6 times a year. Outdoor reported about 0.10 pounds or 45 grams per square foot. 93% reported that they only harvest once a year, which makes sense. Greenhouse, they said that they got 0.04 pounds or 18 grams per square foot. 48% said that they only harvested once per year. 33% said that they harvested twice a year. So accounting for sample size, the surveyors stated that the average reported flower price was about $853, but there was a range between per pound, a range between $200 and $1,900 per pound. That was the range, and then they averaged it. Also important to note that not everyone's square footage was the same, and certainly not everyone's cultivation style had the same kind of square footage associated with it. Let's say you have you're somebody who can get budworm moths, and let's be very generous here. In my experience, I don't know what other people's experience has been. I've certainly seen people who have had a ton of trouble with budworm moths, and they're very, very hungry larvae. But in my experience, it can be pretty egregious. You can get 50% crop loss or even total crop loss in some cases. I have seen it happen. It does happen. And the worst part about it is that, like a lot of pests that are really difficult to deal with, you don't realize that the battle is already kind of lost before you even detected it in some cases. And that's why crop scouting is so important, because if you're not in tune with some of these details, if you don't know there are seasonal incidents, if you don't do things to prevent, then you can have a very costly situation. Now, based on this data, that isn't necessarily what occurred for some of these people. 1 in 5 had no crop damage, which is pretty good, and I hope that stays the case for many people. I hope that actually increases as much as possible. But let's say you have budworms, and let's give you an example that, based on the data we have in the survey, that one harvest, if you're an outdoor, is about 45 grams per square foot. Let's say you have 10,000 square feet, and so then you get about 450,000 grams, or about 993 pounds. Sold at an average of $853 per pound, that would be a gross total of about $847,000 and some dollars. Gross, not accounting for salaries, not accounting for taxes, not accounting for all this other, exsanguination. If you look at a cotton bollworm moth or a corn earworm moth, which are both species that attack cannabis and are known as budworms when they're larvae. So one cotton bollworm moth can lay about 400 to 1,000 eggs. Okay, maximal. And they've been known to travel as far as 750 kilometers, which is about, what do I have here, 466 miles. That's extremely far. That's from Texas to Arkansas, for example. So they can move a very great distance. That's my point of bringing this up. So just because your local area might not have a lot of budworms, or maybe you live like above the 30th parallel or something, where, at least in the United States of America and other parts of Eurasia, and Asia proper, it gets cold, and it kills a lot of the insects and other things like that. Or they have to overwinter, and many of them die, but some of them still are able to survive into next generation. But also, because these moths, they travel so fast, they can get their start in spring and summer, more southern, and then they can travel as it gets warmer up into the northern area. So just because you do have that advantage, it doesn't mean that it's a foolproof advantage, or that you can't also be struck by budworms. On top of that, if you have a particularly active year last year, then you might have a lot more the next year if the season isn't particularly difficult or something like that for them. So as things get warmer in general, or if you, for whatever reason, have a situation where the budworm moth population is much larger than it normally is, and you don't really know that by being in the area for a long enough time, we're seeing some other data records to inform your treatment decisions, you can have a pretty big problem. So don't let that lull you into a false sense of security, is I guess my point there. You have this data, you have this possibility. If a population damages a minimum of 5% of your crop, which in my experience is very, very low, that would be really great for a lot of people if it was just 5%. But let's say it's just 5%. And that means that it threatens about 46 pounds, and that's about $39,792. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of labor. That's a lot of inputs, right? Even if you're not growing for some sort of a profit, it's still a lot of time and labor investment, and certainly, your inputs do cost money in most cases. So it would really suck if you aren't able to, utilize that yield that you've spent so much time to try to grow and cultivate. And in many cases, take a lot of effort to make it the best you can, especially in a home grow or a craft situation. But the budworms don't care. They'll eat mids and they'll eat dank, and it doesn't really matter one way or the other to them, unfortunately for us. So if you apply a microbial product, let's say, I have an example one here that I've done some, back of the envelope calculations just to keep it simple. Let's say you have Budrot. Let's switch from moths to Budrot here for this example, because I think it's more relevant to people. Let's say you want to prevent 10,000 square feet. So if you have a plant density or a plant load of about 1.5 plants per square foot, and I usually deal with square meters, so if I do get the math wrong, please tell me in the comments. But I think I have it all good. So if your plant load is 1.5 plants per square foot, then that means you have about 15,000 plants total in 10,000 square feet. This may require let's say for the product, about 0.5 grams or 0.016 ounces per 100 square feet of canopy. Let's say you're using a fogger for this microbial product that's supposed to prevent bud rot, right? That means that you'll need about 50 grams per 10,000 square feet for one application. Just one, and that's the really crucial detail here, I think. Many people probably know where I'm going with this. So if the product's about $150 for, let's say, 100 grams, that means that you get about 2 applications for $150. If August through October is your, and in my experience this is when I was getting the most calls for bud rot during, the pre-Croptober rush, if that's bud rot season for you, and it is for many people, and you want to apply, let's say, once per week for preventative measures, maybe you have to apply more, maybe you have to apply less, but this is the example here. If you apply once per week, and that's good enough, and you know that already, then that's 12 weeks, or about $900 for prevention, plus labor, which, if we want to factor that in, if you're in a commercial setting, maybe that's $25 per hour, times maybe 3, maybe it takes about 3 hours to do the whole fogging, minutia, including prep and mix and all of that, and then setting up and then tearing down and cleaning everything. So maybe like 3 hours. And then you multiply that by 12 weeks, that's an additional $900. So $1,800 in total for the cost. Plus occupational time, because again, people like yourself who might be doing one thing can't be doing many other things at the same time. Maybe some things. Maybe you can listen to a podcast. Maybe you can learn some stuff while you're doing that too. Maybe you can listen to this live stream while you're spraying or putting in inputs or doing whatever you're doing. That's another cost that is important to bring up as well. But that's the cost versus losing a minimum, let's say 1% of like 9.93 pounds using the average from before. That's about $7,958 to bud rot. So it's still like, much less expensive to apply this preventative plan. Is a lot more time consuming for yourself to like plan out, research what products to use, maybe access somebody who has that domain knowledge who can help you make those decisions for yourself, watching some YouTube videos, doing whatever you're trying to do to figure out your plan, buying the product so that you have access to it and you have enough of it that you can apply to your whole area. All of that stuff takes time. You have to have the wherewithal and the logistical fortitude to be able to do that. The alternative is that you do nothing, or you think you're going to be fine. And again, like the survey said, a good 20% of people were fine, but maybe you're not in that 20%, maybe you're in that 80%. And if you have a much more realistic outcome with bud rot, then the cost associated could be quite a bit greater. And if you're not using cannabis as a way to make money, then it is still going to be massively expensive for you, because you might lose, like, again, a third or maybe a half of your crop. And you can't remediate it, you have to cut out the flower, and a lot of times, you might even have to cut out the entire plant sometimes if it really gets very extensive as well. So that's just like one example. I'm bringing this up because although I think a lot of people kind of already know this, some people might not be aware of the sort of basics of this equation. And I think it becomes very apparent that even if we're not even accounting for all of the various costs and sort of other secondary and tertiary outcomes, very much oversimplified, it still kind of makes sense to be preventative. And I know it takes a lot more effort and you have to be more vigilant, but that vigilance, it does save you in the end. And in the off chance, or perhaps not very off chance, that you actually do have a problem, a lot of times people contact me when they've already got a massive issue. And the intellectually honest answer is it might not be possible for you based on the resources that you have outlined. So that's another reason why, if you are contacting someone like in a consulting capacity or something like that, you kind of want to know before you do so, what are the things that are possible? What do you think you have a problem with? What are your available control measures? And if you have an SOP or an IPM plan, then you know all of that kind of already, and then you can make use of that person, and their own resources much more effectively. But if you kind of fly by the seat of your pants, then it can be a little bit more difficult. But I think I've belabored that point a bit already. So actually at this point, I think that I have kind of made my main point. I gave a couple of examples here. We could maybe talk about some other examples in the comments, but I'm going to take a look at what some of the questions are and see if I can answer any of them already.